Take a look at this crown. It weighs over 2 kilograms and is made up of over 3,380 diamonds, 368 pearls, 5 emeralds and 2 spinels, mounted on a golden frame lined with velvet. Now it may seem extravagant, but at the time, this was a very cheap crown. That's because the jewels used were taken from Iran's reserves rather than being bought or commissioned from the European market, as was common at the time. This was done because the Shah needed as much legitimacy as possible. Coming from a tribal family who had never held any title, held any land, or had no connection whatsoever to local or tribal nobility. His father had been a low-ranking officer who had died while he was still an infant. And now he was about to be crowned as the king of over 12 million people, starting one of the most influential dynasties of the 20th century. A dynasty which some are now calling upon to rule again.
With open calls for regime change,
calls for the overthrow of Iran's supreme leader,
demands for a new form of government to replace the 47-year-old Islamic Republic. The regime has cut off internet and phone lines, making it difficult to know the extent of what's happening.
You are one of the longest ruling monarchs in the world today, Your Majesty. 33 years, you've survived assassination attempts, internal strife, external threats.
The year is 1914, and Iran has just been through a major political shake-up. A series of protests starting in 1905, which we now know as the Constitutional Revolution, have just happened. A mix of economic hardship, incompetent leadership from the Qajars, and a healthy dose of foreign interference have led the clerical and merchant classes in an uprising against the monarchy. The Qajar dynasty, who up till now have been in power since 1789, are becoming increasingly incompetent at running the government. Their weakness is being exploited by Britain and Russia, who are trying to use Iran as a buffer state between the two expanding empires. See, what you have to understand about this period in history is that it's the early 20th century. These militarized, industrialized, and imperial countries are taking over the world. Iran is seeing these advanced European countries expanding their empires through conquest of the Third World. And they're starting to realize that if they want to remain independent from these empires, they're going to have to start adopting their practices. Ideas like republicanism, militarism, nationalism spread like wildfire among the dissatisfied population. Keep in mind that Iran at this point in time is not a powerful country by any stretch of the word. It has a very weak and corrupt state. They've made all these concessions to foreign powers. They barely have any factories. They're just getting phone lines. Most of the economy is agrarian, with most farming done by hand. That means no machinery, no tractors, no nothing. And they don't even have a single railway, mostly because Russia and Britain blocked it, and they only had a couple kilometers of paved road. Compare this to Britain at the time, which had 28,000 miles of railway, France, which was producing 45,000 cars a year, or compare this to Germany at the time, where they produced 17.6 million tons of steel every year. What that looks like is a perpetual fire. That's a direct quote of what the skyline looked like in Germany's industrial heartland. This comparison, when outlined by some of the first newspapers in the country, was enough to rile up enough middle-class merchants, clerics, and professionals who were able to use that anger to push through this constitutional revolution. In 1906, this revolution culminated with the production of the Constitution, which limited the Shah, or king's power, and established a majlis, or parliament, to keep the Shah in check. This imitated a lot of the parliamentary systems seen in Europe at the time. The problem was that it didn't work. The system was fraught with indecision, corruption, and politicians and the Shah constantly struggling for more and more power over each other and the state. In 1908, Muhammad Ali Shah, with some help from the Russians, bombarded the Majlis with artillery and suspended the fledgling constitution. A year later, a counter-coup was launched where constitutionalists from Tabriz, Gilan, and Isfahan marched on Tehran and successfully deposed the Shah, reinstating the 1906 constitution. Following the convening of the Second Majlis, Morgan Shuster is hired to help rescue the country's finances, which had been systematically destroyed through predatory loans from Britain and Russia. Shasta was chosen by the Majles as America was, at least at the time, viewed as a neutral and non-imperial and yet industrialized country, therefore making it a seemingly reliable partner for the development of Iran. Shasta was quite popular and did his best to reform and modernize the country. The Russians, however, saw Shasta as a threat and issued them an ultimatum: expel Shasta or be invaded. Shortly afterwards, Shasta was dismissed. All this leads us to 1914 and the beginning of the First World War. Iran had been split into two zones of influence before the war, the British and the Russians. So naturally, the Germans were keen on helping the Iranians fight back both of these powers to divert resources away from their respective fronts in Europe. By 1916, the British were getting increasingly worried that they were being undermined by this resistance, and formed the SPR, or South Persia Rifles, to quell the tribal unrest which had been funded and armed by Germany. This, in effect, meant a large part of Iran was occupied by British troops, an occupation which would outlast the war. In addition to this occupation in the south, Russian and Ottoman armies in the west ignored Iran's sovereignty entirely, frequently fighting each other on Persian soil, laying waste to Iranian villages and farms, and getting its civilian population caught up in the brutal crossfire. One of the most influential factors in Iran during and after the war is the collapse of the Russian Empire and the rise of the Bolsheviks. 1917 was a year of immense change in Iran, perhaps even more so than during the Constitutional Revolution. That's because one of the two major powers which has been encroaching on Iranian sovereignty for nearly a century has just collapsed. And the new communist government has renounced all unequal treaties and all these historical documents which have been holding Iran down. What this means in effect is that there is now a massive power vacuum in the north of the country. Russian troops in Iran retreat to the Caucasus, ready to fight in the new civil war between the Bolsheviks and Imperial Russia. Without the Russians to counterbalance British influence, the British are frothing at the mouth at the prospect of another client state, and they keep pushing further north. They keep taking more control and expanding their sphere of influence. The impact of a successful communist revolution on the world was huge. Across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, fledgling communist movements started to gain legitimacy and traction, as growing dissatisfaction with the war, colonialism, and classism inspired millions to go on strikes and take up arms. One such movement to gain a lot of momentum was the Jangali movement in Iran. Initially founded by a revolutionary from the Constitutional Revolution named Kuchek Khan, the Jangali movement was a socialist insurgency focused on guerrilla warfare, which was initially funded in part through the Young Turks in the Ottoman Empire and Germany as part of their war efforts in Iran. Following the rise of Bolshevism in Russia and the increasing fatigue of the Central Powers, the Jangalis opted to align themselves with Marxists in the hopes of receiving more aid from the Soviets than they were getting from the Central Powers. Kuchek Khan opposed this, as he favored a more nationalistic Islamist approach similar to that of the Young Turks, but he was overruled and the requirement for outside resources turned the Jangalis further and further left. It's now 1918 and the First World War is coming to a close. Unfortunately for Iran, that doesn't mean things are getting better. The sustained pressure of the war and a series of severe droughts proved too much for Iran's primitive agriculture, creating a brutal famine from 1917 to 1919 that painfully coincided with the influenza pandemic. Conservative estimates say that around 1 million people died as a result of these tragedies, a number which is even more staggering when you consider the total population of Iran was around 9 million. To make matters worse, Iran was blocked from joining the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, where other countries were able to air their grievances about the war. This meant that while other countries aired their grievances, split up the territory of the losing empires, and demanded war reparations for the damage they had sustained, the Iranian delegation sent to Paris was blocked by Britain and wasn't allowed to make any claims at all. The motivations of the British in this are twofold. Firstly, Iran is now a heavily armed nation. A flood of guns provided by German, Ottoman, British, and Russian troops during the war are now left over in an increasingly unstable country, so the British had their excuse for maintaining the SPR to stave off insurrection from tribal warlords or the Jangalis. Secondly, the Russians have all left to fight in their civil war. The balance of power which has kept Iran's sovereignty intact for decades has totally collapsed, and the British are keen to take advantage. See, the more discontent and instability there is in Iran, the easier it'll be for them to accept integration into the British Empire. But why? Why is the British Empire so keen on colonizing this useless, pre-industrialized bit of desert in the Middle East? For that, we have to look back to 1901, when a man called William d'Arcy made a deal with the tribes in Baluchistan for the rights to any oil he found there. He bought the rights for a sum of £20,000, roughly £2 million in today's money, on the condition that he would pay 16% of any profits he made back to the Iranian state. To be clear, the deal was made in 1901 before anyone had any idea that there was any oil in the ground. That's why the terms of the deal were so good. The Iranians thought it was free money. All that changes in 1908, when they struck gold. Well, oil. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, or APOC, was formed shortly afterwards and quickly realized that what they had hit was the largest known oil reserve on the planet. For Britain in 1919, the d'Arcy oil concession was a golden ticket. The World War had just been won, in part thanks to these futuristic technologies like planes and tanks, both of which need oil to run. What had once been used simply as kerosene for lighting was now the lifeblood of the global economy. Seemingly overnight, oil becomes as important as water, and Iran is the Pacific fucking Ocean. It is in large part thanks to this newly found oil wealth that Britain puts forth the 1919 agreement to the Iranian Majlis. The 1919 agreement would guarantee the British all oil rights to the whole country. In return, the British would give the Iranians a £2 million loan for reforms, build railways to connect the British Raj with their newly acquired holdings in the Middle East, and supply ammunition, guns, and training for a British-led army to quell the instability that had plagued the country for years. Put in plain language, this is exactly the contract the Constitutional Revolution had been trying to prevent. The British imperial ambition had set its sights on Persia. And with no Russian counterbalance, no representation from France or the United States, and Turkish and German interests fought off in the war, there was no one left to oppose the British but the Persians themselves. The 1919 agreement was unlike the concessions that came before it. It wasn't a tobacco monopoly or selling oil rights. What was being proposed was the sale of Iranian sovereignty and nationhood in return for security and money, being offered during the most painful and humiliating decade in Iranian memory. Needless to say, the agreement was deeply unpopular with the Iranian public, with some alleging that bribery and corruption was the only reason for its signing by the Prime Minister in 1919. Though it was signed, it was never ratified by the Majlis, and the British struggled to enforce it. Fierce opposition led many to join insurrectionist movements like the Jangalis with Kuchak Khan, and growing discontent from soldiers returning home from the war meant Britain was starting to fear for its own security at home, putting territorial ambitions on hold as it wrestled with its own domestic struggles. We're now going to focus on the story of one man called Reza Khan. He grew up poor in Iran's northern provinces. His father was a petty officer in the Qajar army, and he had little to no schooling. He joined the Cossack Brigade at 15 in 1893 and spent the next 2.5 decades slowly rising through the ranks until 1917, when the Russian Tsars were deposed. See, the Cossacks in theory were a branch of the Qajar dynasty, separate from the military, who were better trained, equipped, disciplined, and paid than regular army officers. Tasked with security of the Shah, government ministries, tax collecting, and guarding diplomatic missions. But here's the thing. The reason they were better trained, better funded, better equipped is because they were Russian. The officers were Russian, they were funded by the Russians, they were trained by the Russians. So in effect, the most elite fighting force in Iran was a Russian Cossack brigade. What this means is that when Russia falls in 1917 into a revolution and the fall of the Tsar, is that all of the Russian officers go back to Russia to fight the civil war, leaving the leadership in the Cossack brigade non-existent. All the Russian officers have left, all that remains are a few Iranian petty officers. This leaves the remaining Cossack brigade leaderless, unpaid, and illegitimate, leading to a power struggle between the remaining Russian loyalist officers and petty Iranian officers who quickly rise through the ranks. Reza Khan was one such officer, known for his brutality and discipline. He wasn't guided by the same ideological fervor as many of his compatriots, allowing him to rise through the ranks rapidly. By 1920, he became commander of the Tehran Cossack Brigade, the most powerful military unit in the country. Seeking stability following the failed implementation of the 1919 agreement, Cossack payroll was funded by the British, who were increasingly fearful of the spread of Bolshevism in Iran. With communist movements also gaining traction at home, Britain was afraid and struggling to keep its domestic population happy. They were also having to put down an expensive revolt in Iraq, and were craving stability. Britain was limping forward, trying to hold the empire together following the economic fallout of the end of the First World War. The British general who had made the decision to continue funding Cossack payroll later justified the decision, saying, Reza Khan was the only officer capable of restoring order. These fears lead the British to back a coup in 1921, where Reza Khan marches his Cossack brigade into Tehran and seizes power. The new Prime Minister is called Saeed Zia al-Din Tabatabai. One of the first things this new Prime Minister does is sign the Russo-Persian Treaty of Friendship. This agreement, signed in Moscow, ensured cooperation between Iran and the new Soviet government, and officially ended the Turkmenchai Treaty, which had been a burden on Iran for decades. What this means practically is that Iran has now returned to its position as a buffer state between the British Empire and the new Soviet Empire. Iran's buffer state position asserted that neither Britain nor the Soviets would be able to invade Iran without risking retaliation from the other. This infuriates the British, who have just missed their chance at expanding the empire and uniting the Raj with their Middle Eastern holdings. Connecting their overland empire, it also means the communists withdraw their support for the Jangali movement, leading to its destruction by Reza Khan, whose popularity soared from crushing tribal revolts and bringing military security back to the nation. He strengthens the military, disposes of Qajar elites, pacifies the country, and forces through a series of modernist reforms. What the Majlis had failed to do in 15 years, Reza Khan had done in 3. As Abbas Amanat puts it in his book, it was as if a surgical knife had lanced an infested cyst that had long troubled Iran's body. Contrastingly, the new Prime Minister Zia was deeply unpopular. The British involvement in the coup had made him look like a puppet, a painful reminder of the British subjugation they had narrowly avoided. Despite the wide criticisms, Zia was ahead of his time, bullish on policies of education for all, Europeanization of the legal system, and land and tax reforms. He was exiled by Reza Khan at the request of the Qajar Shah, lasting less than 100 days as Prime Minister, nearly double Liz Truss. Reza Khan was immediately appointed as Prime Minister to replace Zia, but despite his popularity with the public, Reza Khan was blocked from being appointed leader of the Republic by Qajar loyalists and religious conservatives, who were afraid of the secular reforms he advocated for. This infuriated Reza Khan, who travelled to the city of Qom. This is because back in 1920, 3 Grand Ayatollahs had been expelled from British Iraq due to their role in the revolt. Reza Khan had granted them refuge here as a gesture of goodwill, but now he was going to cash in his chips. After the 3 Grand Ayatollahs met with Reza Khan, they issued a statement to all mosques and bazaars in the country, stating that Reza Khan should be appointed the leader of the country and that the Republican movement should be, quote, obliterated. Originally, the plan had been to establish a republic, following in the footsteps of the Young Turk movement next door, which had managed to relegate their own monarchy to a constitutional one back in 1908. But that idea wasn't particularly popular among religious classes even before the Ayatollahs denounced it. See, they saw republicanism as a departure from tradition and their own history, and sort of saw it as a gateway to the hedonism of the West, as republicanism is synonymous with secularism, women's suffrage, and modernization. See, Iran is faced with a dilemma. Republicanism is too radical, it's too forward, and it's deeply unpopular. But so is the monarchy. See, the Qajar leadership have been ineffective for ages. Muzaffar ad-Din Shah had only reluctantly signed the constitution after years of accepting bad loans from foreign powers and worsening the already weak economy. Muhammad Ali Shah had attempted to overthrow the government, and Ahmad Shah, who ascended to the throne at age 11, never commanded the authority of a king, spent most of his time in Europe, and oversaw the collapse of Iran. But Iran has always been a nation of kings. With the exception of the early Islamic period, Iran has been ruled by a king since 550 years before Christ. Iran has been a monarchy for over 1,000 years before it was Islamic. The modern string of Shahs started in 1501 and has gone uninterrupted since then. So the idea of completely abolishing the monarchy is incredibly radical and unstable at a time when all the country wants is stability. In July 1924, the American Vice Consul Robert Embry hears of a well in Tehran where a blind man has regained his vision after repenting there. He decides to visit the well and photograph it. Upon his arrival, Robert is accused either of poisoning the well or of being a Baha'i. This creates an angry mob who pull Robert from his carriage and beat him. The police manage to break up the mob in time and save him and take him to the hospital, but shortly afterwards, the mob breaks into the hospital and beats him to death. This was the catalyst which showed the international community that the current Iranian regime was not fit for purpose, and gave Reza Khan the justification he needed to seize power. Reza Khan, at this time, controls the only modern military in the country. His domestic political opponents have all been bought or intimidated. He's friendly with the Russians, and now the British have given him a green light to overthrow the Qajars. It's easy to point to this point as the breaking point for Iranian democracy. But in reality, Reza Khan has been Shah in all but name since 1921. His popularity and dominance over the military meant in reality he could have pushed through any policy he wanted, even if he didn't have the title in name. So his appointment as Shah is really more of a ceremonial thing than it is a true transfer of power. That's how we get back to this crown. A crown for a man who was never born to be a king, but a man who seized it for himself. Reza Khan never disbanded or renounced the constitution. Elections were held and ministers were appointed. But the process was hollowed out from within. Opposition parties were intimidated, freedom of speech, press, and assembly were prohibited, and the Shah directly controlled the army, police, and provincial governors. It was in the run-up to his coronation where Reza Khan chose the last name Pahlavi for his dynasty. Prior to his rule, last names weren't really a thing in Iran, with the exception of nobility, so the significance of the name Pahlavi, which was chosen, is not to be ignored. It's a word which evokes a pre-Islamic Iranian nationalism, relating back to the Sasanian Empire in the 3rd century. The name was perfect. It improved Reza Khan's legitimacy and tied him to a line of Shahs which had been in power in the country for nearly 2 millennia. Over the next 50 years, the Pahlavi dynasty would pull Iran from being a destitute backwater into one of the most influential players in the region and one of the most influential countries in the world. It would spark the backlash that built the Iran we now know today and build the foundation for the Iran we may see in a very near future.